They said they loved me. They said they wanted me close. They smiled when they handed me the key to their beautiful home and told me I'd finally be safe. But they forgot to mention the cameras. Or maybe they didn't want to. At first, I didn't realize my every breath was being recorded, analyzed, and sold. But then I found the files. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 71, I discovered that family doesn't always mean what you think it does. After losing my husband Richard to cancer 2 years ago, I'd been rattling around our small ranch house in suburban Denver, the silence growing heavier with each passing winter. The house we bought together in 1985 had become a museum of memories, his reading glasses still on the nightstand, his coffee mug unwashed in the sink, the indent in his favorite armchair where he'd sit every evening watching the news. When my daughter Sarah finally convinced me to move into their smart home in Highlands Ranch, I thought I was joining a family. I didn't know I was becoming a product. "Mom, you're being stubborn," she'd say during our weekly phone calls, her voice carrying that particular blend of exasperation and concern that adult children perfect when dealing with aging parents. Mike and I have that beautiful guest suite downstairs. The kids would love having Grandma around more. And honestly, we worry about you being alone in that big house. Sarah worked in tech marketing for a Fortune 500 company, always talking about user engagement and behavioral analytics in ways that made my head spin. Her husband Mike ran a startup focused on smart home solutions, whatever that meant. Their house in Highlands Ranch was a showcase of modern living, sleek lines, automated everything, and enough gadgets to run a small business. Every light switch was a touch screen, every appliance connected to the internet, every room monitored by some invisible system that Mike was endlessly proud of. "It's the future, Margaret," he'd tell me whenever I struggled with a voice-activated coffee maker or accidentally triggered the motion sensors in the hallway. "Soon everyone will live like this. We're just ahead of the curve." The pressure to move in with them had been building for months. Sarah would drive over unannounced, finding reasons to criticize my housekeeping or express concern about my isolation. She'd mention how I'd forgotten to return her calls, how the yard looked neglected, how I seemed confused during our last conversation. Each visit felt like an inspection, a careful cataloging of my supposed decline. When they finally wore me down and I agreed to move in, Sarah acted like she'd won the lottery. She hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone who just solved a particularly troublesome problem, her relief palpable. Mike immediately began talking about optimizing my living experience and integrating me into their ecosystem. The transition seemed smooth at first. I had my own entrance through the walkout basement, a kitchenette with granite countertops that cost more than my first car, and a living area with panoramic mountain views that took my breath away every morning. The space was beautiful, sterile but beautiful. Everything was beige and white and perfectly coordinated, like a hotel suite designed by someone who'd never actually lived anywhere. The grandkids, Emma and Jake, would bounce downstairs after school, their backpacks heavy with tablets and devices I couldn't begin to understand. I'd help with homework while Sarah managed conference calls upstairs, her voice carrying through the smart speakers scattered throughout the house. "Alexa, remind me about the Peterson meeting. Alexa, what's the weather? Alexa, play some background music." For the first few weeks, I felt useful again, needed. I'd pick up the kids from school, help with dinner preparation, fold laundry while watching the news on the massive television that Mike had mounted on the wall. The house hummed with quiet efficiency. Lights that dimmed automatically at sunset, temperatures that adjusted based on occupancy, music that followed you from room to room. But there were odd moments that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite articulate why. Mike would make casual comments about how their system tracked energy usage and foot traffic patterns, how it learned everyone's routines and preferences. "The house knows when you're coming before you do," he'd say with pride, showing me graphs on his phone that tracked our movements throughout the day. Sarah would mention how convenient it was to monitor the house remotely when they traveled, how she could check on the kids from her office, how the security system sent alerts about unusual activity. "It's like having eyes everywhere," she'd laugh, not seeming to notice how that phrase made my skin crawl. I assumed it was just tech industry speak. Everything was data to them, every human behavior something to be quantified and optimized. They talked about their own children the way scientists might discuss lab subjects, analyzing Emma's screen time and Jake's sleep patterns with clinical detachment. The smart speakers were the worst part. They'd light up at random moments, supposedly responding to words that sounded like Alexa, but I began to suspect they were listening more than they let on. I'd be talking to myself while cooking, a habit I developed during the lonely months after Richard's death, and the device would suddenly chime to life, offering weather updates or asking if I needed anything. "It's just getting to know you," Mike would explain when I mentioned feeling watched. "The AI learns your patterns, so it can be more helpful." It's actually pretty sophisticated technology. I started speaking more quietly when I was alone, which felt ridiculous but somehow necessary. The house seemed to have ears everywhere, invisible presences that cataloged every sigh, every muttered complaint, every moment of private grief. The real test came in October when they planned a long weekend in Napa Valley. Sarah approached me on a Wednesday morning, already dressed in the kind of expensive casual where that looked effortless but probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She was holding her ever-present tablet, scrolling through what looked like travel itineraries. "Mom, Mike and I are thinking of taking a little trip next weekend. Just the two of us. We haven't had a couple's getaway in years." Her smile was bright, practiced. "We trust you completely with the house and the kids. Emma has soccer practice Saturday morning, and Jake has his piano lesson, but other than that, you'll have a nice, quiet weekend." She hugged me stiffly, the kind of embrace that felt more like a gesture than genuine affection. "Just relax and enjoy having the place to yourself. The fridge is fully stocked, the garden might need some watering, and you can treat the house like your own." There was something in her tone that bothered me, a careful, rehearsed quality, as if she'd practiced these exact words. But I nodded and smiled, grateful for the trust they were showing me, touched that they felt comfortable leaving me in charge of their beautiful home and precious children. I should have realized then that people who truly trust you don't need to announce it so explicitly. Trust is quiet, assumed, never performed. But I was still thinking like a mother who wanted to believe the best of her daughter, still hoping that this arrangement might actually work. As they prepared to leave that Friday morning, Mike spent an unusual amount of time checking various devices around the house, tapping screens and adjusting settings with the focused attention of someone conducting a final systems check. Sarah reminded me twice about the emergency contact numbers on the refrigerator and made sure I had their hotel information. "Call if you need anything at all," she said, kissing my cheek. "But honestly, the house pretty much runs itself. You'll probably find it wonderfully peaceful." They pulled out of the driveway in Mike's Tesla, the kids waving sleepily from the back seat as they headed to their respective activities. I stood on the front porch, watching the car disappear around the corner, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete solitude. But as I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of a small red light blinking in what I'd assumed was a smoke detector near the front door. For just a moment, it felt less like solitude and more like being alone on a stage, with an invisible audience watching from the darkness. I shook off the feeling and went inside to make myself a cup of tea. After all, they trusted me with their home. The least I could do was trust them in return.
If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
That first evening alone, I made myself tea and settled into the main living room upstairs, something I rarely did when they were home. The space felt different without the constant hum of family activity, larger somehow, more echoing. I brought a mystery novel from my collection downstairs, one of those cozy British detective stories that Richard used to tease me about. As I reached for the lamp switch beside the leather sectional, I noticed a small device tucked behind the family photos on the mantel. At first glance, it looked like a motion sensor, the kind you'd expect in a security system. But something about its placement seemed deliberate, aimed directly at the seating area rather than the room's entry points. I told myself I was being paranoid. After 2 years of living alone, jumping at every unusual sound, maybe I was seeing threats where none existed. But over the next day, I started noticing other things that seemed off. The way the smart speaker's light would pulse when I talked to myself while cooking, even when I hadn't said the wake word. A tiny lens embedded in what looked like a smoke detector above the kitchen island, positioned to capture the entire cooking and dining area. The suspicious uniformity of the decorative objects positioned throughout the house, small, black devices that looked like modern art but seemed to have tiny apertures in their surfaces. I began testing my suspicions. While making lunch, I deliberately spoke about wanting to call my old friend Helen in Phoenix. Within an hour, my tablet started showing advertisements for Arizona vacation packages. When I mentioned feeling tired during my morning routine, my phone suggested sleep aids and meditation apps. The house was listening, but how much was it hearing? And who else was listening along with it? By the second night, I couldn't ignore the growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. I waited until well past midnight, then crept upstairs to Mike's home office. I'd only been inside once before, when Sarah had given me the initial tour of the house. The door was usually locked, but when I turned the knob that night, it gave easily. Inside, the office was nothing like the minimalist aesthetic of the rest of the house. It was cluttered with technology, multiple monitors, servers humming quietly in a corner, cables snaking across the floor like electronic vines. The air smelled of heated electronics and Mike's cologne, a sharp, synthetic scent that reminded me of a doctor's office. I sat down slowly in front of the main computer. To my surprise, it was still logged in, the screens alive with data streams and monitoring interfaces. This wasn't just a home office, it was a command center. The desktop was organized with military precision, folders labeled with codes and dates I didn't understand. But one folder made my blood run cold. M_Chin_analytics. My folder, with my name on it. I clicked it open with trembling fingers. Inside were subfolders labeled by room and activity. Kitchen_behavioral_data, living_room_movement_patterns, bathroom_usage_analytics, sleep_monitoring, social_interaction_logs. Each folder contained gigabytes of data. Video files showing me cooking, cleaning, reading, sleeping. Audio recordings of my phone calls with friends, my conversations with the grandchildren, even my private moments talking to Richard's photograph. Charts and graphs analyzing my daily routines, my emotional states, my physical movements throughout the house. There were spreadsheets tracking how often I used the bathroom at night, how long I spent looking out windows, how many times I touched my wedding ring during conversations. Graphs showing my social interaction levels based on phone call frequency and duration. Even a mood analysis chart that claimed to identify my emotional state based on vocal patterns and facial expressions captured by hidden cameras. The clinical detachment of it all was breathtaking. I wasn't a family member in these files. I was subject M1, an elderly female test case for behavioral analysis software. But the worst was yet to come. Buried deeper in the folder structure, I found a presentation titled Case Study, Integrated Monitoring in Multi-Generational Households, Phase 1 Results. It featured screenshots of me going about my daily life, sleeping, cooking, reading, crying during a particularly difficult evening when I'd been missing Richard. Each image was annotated with clinical observations. Subject demonstrates typical grief response patterns. Isolation behaviors consistent with depression markers. Potential intervention triggers identified. They weren't just watching me, they were studying me like a lab specimen. The presentation continued with profit projections and market analysis. Mike's company, VitaWatch, wasn't just developing eldercare monitoring systems, they were planning to commercialize the surveillance of elderly people in their own homes, using their own families as unwitting research subjects. I found emails between Sarah and Mike that made my hands shake as I read them. Sarah had written, "Mom's been the perfect test case. She doesn't suspect anything, and the data on cognitive decline patterns could be really valuable for the next funding round. The investors are going to love the authentic behavioral baseline we've established." Mike's response was even worse. "The integration has been seamless. She's adapted to the smart home environment exactly as predicted. We should have enough data for the prototype demonstration by Q4. Your mom might actually help us change the entire eldercare industry." They were talking about me like I was a product they were developing, a prototype they were testing. Every kindness, every expression of concern, every insistence that I move in with them for my own safety, it had all been calculated to put me in this glass cage where they could observe and analyze my every movement. I sat in that office for what felt like hours, reading through months of surveillance data, corporate presentations, and casual email exchanges about my life. They had documented everything. My sleep patterns when I had nightmares about Richard, my eating habits during periods of grief, my phone conversations with friends, even my bathroom schedule. There were video clips labeled with timestamps and behavioral tags. Emotional episode, October 3rd, 24, 3:47 a.m. Confusion pattern, kitchen, September 15th, 24, social interaction. Phone call with Helen, mood analysis positive. They had reduced my entire existence to data points and behavioral categories. In one email thread, Sarah discussed whether they should intervene when the data showed I was having a particularly difficult week, missing Richard. Not out of concern for my well-being, but because they worried my grief might skew the baseline metrics they needed for their presentation to investors. That's when I understood with crystal clarity that I wasn't their beloved family member. I was their prototype. I was a test subject who happened to be biologically related to one of the researchers. Every moment of trust, every feeling of gratitude for their care, every sense of belonging I developed in their home, it had all been an illusion. They had built a beautiful, comfortable cage, filled it with every amenity I could want, and then invited me to live inside it while they documented my captivity for profit. I carefully photographed the computer screens with my phone, copying the most damning emails and presentations. I found a flash drive in Mike's desk drawer and began copying files, working quietly in the blue glow of the monitors while the house slept around me. As I waited for the data to transfer, I looked around the office with new eyes. The multiple monitors weren't just for Mike's work, they were surveillance stations. The servers in the corner weren't just storing family photos and documents, they were processing and analyzing every moment of my life in real time. I had been living inside a laboratory, and I hadn't even known I was the experiment. When the files finished copying, I carefully returned everything to exactly how I'd found it. I crept back downstairs to my room, flash drive hidden in my jewelry box, and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and wondering how many cameras were watching me process this betrayal. For the first time in months, I was grateful for the insomnia that had plagued me since Richard's death. At least now I knew why the smart speaker had been suggesting sleep aids with such persistent frequency. Even my sleeplessness had been cataloged, analyzed, and prepared for monetization.
If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
I didn't confront them immediately when they returned from Napa Valley. That would have been the old Margaret, the one who reacted emotionally, who trusted that family disputes could be resolved with honest conversation and good intentions. But the Margaret who had spent 3 days discovering the extent of their surveillance was someone different. She was someone who understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up. This was a calculated exploitation that required an equally calculated response. Instead, I spent the rest of their trip meticulously documenting everything. I photographed every hidden camera I could find, noting their positions and angles. I mapped out the sensor network throughout the house, identifying which devices were legitimate smart home technology and which were additional surveillance equipment that had been quietly installed in my living spaces. I created detailed logs of what I'd found on Mike's computer, organizing the information chronologically to show the progression of their monitoring project. The emails revealed that the surveillance had begun before I'd even moved in. They'd been planning to use me as a test subject from the moment they'd first suggested I live with them. Most importantly, I began reaching out to people I trusted. My first call was to Janet Rodriguez, who'd worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. We'd been friends since our children were in elementary school together, and she'd always been the person everyone turned to when they needed someone who understood how systems worked. "Margaret, honey, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked after I'd explained the situation. "I mean, I know families can be complicated, but using surveillance technology on your own mother." "I'm sure, Janet. I have the files, the presentations, the emails discussing profit margins based on data collected from me without my knowledge or consent. This isn't family dysfunction. This is commercial exploitation of an elderly person by her own relatives." There was a long pause. "Okay, if that's really what's happening, then we need to treat this like any other case of elder abuse. You need documentation, legal advice, and probably a safe place to land when this all comes out." My second call was to my nephew David in Sacramento. He'd been a technology journalist for years, covering privacy issues and data protection. When I explained what I'd discovered, his reaction was immediate and sharp. "Aunt Maggie, what you're describing is potentially criminal. Using family members as unwitting test subjects for commercial surveillance technology could violate federal privacy laws, elder abuse statutes, and probably a dozen other regulations. This isn't just morally wrong, it's likely illegal." David walked me through the legal landscape while I took careful notes. Colorado had recently strengthened its privacy laws, particularly around the surveillance of vulnerable populations. The federal government was increasingly cracking down on companies that collected personal data without explicit consent, especially when that data involved health and behavioral information. "The fact that they're planning to commercialize data collected from you without your knowledge makes this even worse," David explained. "They're not just invading your privacy, they're profiting from it. And the fact that you're living in their home under what you believe were family arrangements means they've likely violated laws around informed consent and fiduciary duty." We developed a careful plan. David would start making discreet inquiries with elder rights organizations and privacy advocates, building a network of legal support without alerting anyone in Mike's industry to what we were investigating. Janet would help me understand my legal options and prepare documentation that would protect me if this became a court case. Most importantly, I needed to secure my financial independence. I'd contributed $75,000 from Richard's life insurance policy toward their down payment 5 years earlier. Sarah had called it a family investment, promising that I'd always have a home with them as a result. Now I realized it had been the price of admission to their private research facility. Janet helped me gather financial documents showing my contribution to their mortgage, along with emails and texts where Sarah had acknowledged the investment and promised me permanent housing security in return. We calculated that my original contribution, adjusted for inflation and the property's appreciation, was now worth over $120,000. "If they want to play business," Janet said grimly, "then we'll treat this like a business dispute. Your housing situation will be resolved through financial settlement, not family guilt." When Sarah and Mike returned from Napa Valley, sun-kissed and relaxed, they found me in the living room reading one of my mystery novels. I greeted them warmly, asked about their trip, admired Sarah's photos from the wineries. I was careful to behave exactly as I had before, grateful, unassuming, quietly helpful. But over the next few days, I began making subtle changes to my routine. I started taking long walks around the neighborhood, getting out of the house for hours at a time. I increased my phone calls with friends, making sure to have conversations that couldn't be monitored because they took place outside the house or on my cell phone in areas with poor smart speaker coverage. I also began documenting Mike's behavior more carefully. I noticed how he checked various devices when he thought no one was looking, how he seemed particularly interested in my daily routines, how he'd ask casual questions about my sleep patterns or my mood that now seemed much less innocent. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed increasingly interested in my adjustment to living with them. She'd ask probing questions about whether I felt comfortable, whether I missed my old house, whether I thought this living arrangement was working long-term. Questions that had once seemed like caring check-ins now felt like data collection for their research. 2 weeks after their return, I was ready to act. I'd spent those weeks not just gathering evidence, but preparing for every possible response they might have. I'd secured temporary housing with my friend Eleanor, who'd been delighted to offer me her guest room for as long as I needed it. I consulted with 2 different attorneys who specialized in elder law and privacy rights. I'd even arranged for David to be available by phone during the confrontation, in case I needed immediate backup. On a Thursday evening, while the kids were at their respective activities, I asked Sarah and Mike to sit down with me in the living room. I'd arranged printed copies of their surveillance data on the coffee table, along with a formal letter from Janet outlining my legal position. "I need to discuss something important with you both," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I've discovered that you've been monitoring and recording my private activities without my knowledge or consent." Sarah's face went white. Mike started to speak, but I held up my hand. "Please let me finish. I found the cameras throughout the house, including in my private living space. I've seen the files on your computer, Mike, with months of surveillance data, behavioral analysis, and presentations to investors featuring video of me going about my daily life. I've read the emails discussing how to use data collected from me for your company's profit. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked like she might faint. Mike's face had gone from surprise to calculation. I could almost see him running through damage control scenarios. "Mom, this isn't what it looks like," Sarah finally said, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "You've been monitoring my every move for your husband's business. I'm not your mother in this house. I'm your research subject. You've been collecting data about my most private moments and planning to profit from it." Mike tried to explain that elder care technology was the future, that they were helping families stay connected and safe, that the monitoring was for my own protection. Sarah insisted they were only concerned about my well-being after Dad's death, that they'd never intended to hurt me. But I'd prepared for these responses. I'd read their emails discussing profit margins and investor presentations. I'd seen the video files they'd labeled with clinical terminology describing my episodes of grief and confusion. I'd watched presentation slides featuring my image alongside market research about the commercial potential of elder care surveillance. "I've documented everything," I said, indicating the papers on the coffee table. "I have copies of all the surveillance data, the email communications, the investor presentations featuring my image and personal information. I've consulted with attorneys who specialize in elder abuse and privacy law." I pulled out the letter Janet had helped me draft and placed it on top of the other documents. "You have 3 choices. You can buy out my equity in Dad's life insurance contribution that helped with your down payment, $120,000, which reflects the current value of my investment plus appreciation. You can face a lawsuit for unauthorized surveillance and exploitation of an elderly person, which could result in criminal charges and professional consequences for your business. Or you can help me find my own place, remove every single recording device from this house, and provide written acknowledgement of the privacy violations." David had already started making inquiries with elder rights organizations and data privacy advocates. The legal implications of using a family member as an unwitting test subject for commercial surveillance technology were significant, especially in Colorado, which had recently strengthened its privacy laws around the monitoring of vulnerable populations. The room was silent for what felt like hours. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They'd clearly hoped this day would never come, but they'd probably discussed what they'd do if it did. Finally, Mike spoke. "We never intended for this to feel like exploitation. The monitoring technology is designed to help families stay connected and ensure safety for elderly relatives. We thought you'd appreciate the security it provided. Without my knowledge or consent," I asked, "you've been analyzing my bathroom habits, my grief patterns, my private conversations with friends. You've labeled my moments of missing my dead husband as emotional episodes suitable for investor presentations. In what world is that family care?" Sarah started crying then, whether from guilt, frustration, or fear of consequences, I couldn't tell. "We really did want you close to us, Mom. The family part was real." "Maybe it was," I said, and I meant it. "But the surveillance part was also real. And the business plan was real. And the investor presentations featuring my private moments were real. You can't build genuine family relationships on a foundation of secret commercial exploitation." To their credit, Sarah and Mike didn't fight it much longer. Maybe they realized how wrong they'd been, or maybe they were just afraid of the legal and professional consequences David had outlined. The elder care technology industry was already under scrutiny for privacy violations, and a high-profile case involving the secret surveillance of a company founder's own mother-in-law would be devastating for Mike's business reputation. Within a month, they'd agreed to my terms. They would buy out my housing investment, provide funds for relocation, and remove all surveillance equipment from areas where I'd had a reasonable expectation of privacy. Most importantly, they would provide a written acknowledgement that I'd been monitored without consent and that any data collected about me would be permanently deleted. I spent those weeks house hunting with a freedom I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't looking for anything grand, just a place that was genuinely mine. A place where no one would catalog my movements, question my habits, or measure my value by how quietly I kept to myself. I found a cozy townhouse in Lakewood, closer to the mountains and my old friends. It had a small garden, a front porch with mountain views, and most importantly, Absolutely no smart home technology beyond a basic thermostat and smoke detectors that actually were smoke detectors. The owner was a widow named Eleanor who reminded me of my old library colleagues, practical, kind, and refreshingly honest about what she was offering and why. "I think you'll be happy here," she said after we'd talked for an hour on the front porch. "It's quiet, but not lonely. Private, but not isolated." As I signed the lease, I realized that those distinctions, between quiet and lonely, between private and isolated, were exactly what I'd been missing in Mike and Sarah's smart home. Their house had been isolated despite all its connectivity, lonely despite all its monitoring. This little townhouse promised genuine solitude, the kind where you're alone by choice rather than under observation. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that makes Colorado famous. The aspen trees were turning gold in the foothills, and the air carried that sharp clarity that comes just before winter settles in for good. I'd hired professional movers, not because I had so much to pack, but because I wanted the transition to be clean and official. No lingering goodbyes, no opportunities for Sarah to make last-minute appeals to family loyalty. I'd spent the previous week carefully sorting through my belongings, deciding what belonged to my new life and what should stay behind with the old one. Most of my furniture would remain in the smart home. It had never really been mine anyway, just temporary accommodations in someone else's space. What I took were the things that mattered. My books, my photographs, my grandmother's china, the quilt my sister had made for my wedding. As the movers loaded their truck, I walked through Mike and Sarah's house one last time. In the kitchen, the smart speakers sat silent on their counters, their blue lights dormant. The hidden cameras were still there. We'd agreed they could keep their security system, but any devices that had monitored my private spaces had been removed or disabled. The house felt different now that I knew its secrets. It was still beautiful, still impressive in its technological sophistication, but it felt hollow somehow. Like a museum exhibit about how people might live in the future, rather than a place where anyone actually did live. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway as I was saying goodbye to the space. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked like she'd aged years in the past month. Part of me felt sorry for her. I believed she genuinely thought she was helping me, even as she participated in violating my privacy for commercial gain. "Mom, I know you probably can't forgive us right now, but I hope someday you'll understand that we really did care about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd grown from the little girl who used to help me bake cookies into someone I barely recognized. "I do believe you cared about me, Sarah, but caring about someone and respecting them are different things. You cared about me the way you might care about a pet, wanting me to be safe and comfortable and well-behaved, but not particularly interested in what I wanted or needed as a person." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but it's honest. You invited me into your home, but you never really invited me into your family. I was always a project to be managed, a problem to be solved, and eventually, a resource to be monetized." I picked up my purse and the small box containing Richard's photograph and my jewelry. "I hope your business is successful, Mike. I hope the technology you're developing helps families stay connected. But I hope you remember that real connection requires trust, and trust requires treating people as people, not as data sources." Mike had stayed upstairs during the move, which was probably wise. I'm not sure I could have maintained my composure if I'd had to face him directly. Sarah walked me to the front door, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something together. "Will you let the kids visit you sometimes? They're going to miss their grandmother." "Of course," I said, and I meant it. Emma and Jake are always welcome in my home. They're not responsible for their parents' choices. I gave her a brief hug, not the long, tearful embrace she seemed to want, but not coldly either. Then I walked out to my car, where Eleanor was waiting to drive me to my new life. My townhouse in Lakewood was everything the smart home wasn't. It was smaller, older, and definitely less technologically sophisticated. The hardwood floors creaked when you walked across them. The windows had to be opened manually. The thermostat was analog, with an actual dial you turned to adjust the temperature. It was perfect. Eleanor helped me arrange furniture for the first few days, bringing over casseroles and practical advice with equal generosity. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and knew everyone, introducing me to neighbors who brought welcome gifts and invitations to book clubs and garden societies. "The thing about this place," Eleanor told me as we sat on my front porch with coffee one morning, "is that people here believe in minding their own business in the best possible way. They're available if you need them, but they don't hover. Privacy is respected." Privacy. The word felt like a luxury I'd almost forgotten I was entitled to. My new daily routines developed slowly, organically. I'd wake up naturally, without motion sensors tracking my sleep patterns or smart speakers offering weather updates I hadn't requested. I'd make coffee in a simple machine that didn't connect to the internet or report my consumption habits to anyone. I started gardening seriously for the first time in years, planting late-season vegetables and planting flower beds for spring. Working with soil and seeds felt like the opposite of everything digital: unpredictable, natural, impossible to quantify or optimize. I bought a simple television that only received regular broadcast channels and didn't track my viewing habits. I read books from the library without anyone analyzing my reading patterns or suggesting related titles based on algorithmic preferences. I called friends when I felt like it, not because social interaction metrics suggested I was becoming isolated. The silence in my house was different from the silence in the smart home. It wasn't the hushed quiet of a laboratory where you're always being observed. It was the comfortable silence of genuine solitude, where you can think your own thoughts without wondering who else might be listening. I started writing letters again, actual handwritten letters on paper stationery, mailed in envelopes with stamps. There's something deliciously private about thoughts committed to paper that will only be read by their intended recipient, no corporate servers analyzing sentiment or tracking emotional patterns. 3 weeks after moving in, Emma and Jake came for their first visit. They seemed slightly disoriented by the analog nature of my house. Light switches that were actual switches, a doorbell you had to push, windows you opened by hand. "Grandma, where are the speakers?" Jake asked, looking around my living room in confusion. "There aren't any smart speakers here," I explained. "If I want music, I turn on the radio or play a CD. But how does the house know what you want?" Emma asked, genuinely puzzled. "It doesn't. I tell the house what I want by doing it myself." They adapted quickly, as children do. We baked cookies, using my grandmother's recipe, played board games that didn't require internet connections, and read stories together from actual books. They climbed the oak tree in my backyard without anyone calculating the risk factors or monitoring their activity levels. It was during that visit that I realized what I'd really lost in the smart home and what I'd gained by leaving it. In Mike and Sarah's house, every interaction had been mediated by technology, every moment potentially documented and analyzed. Here, we could just be together without performing for invisible observers. Sarah called periodically, awkward conversations where we talked carefully around the edges of what had happened. She'd ask how I was settling in, whether I needed anything, whether I was happy with my decision. I was cordial but not encouraging. I wasn't ready to pretend our relationship could simply return to what it had been before I knew the truth. But Mike's business did suffer consequences beyond our family dispute. David's contacts in the privacy advocacy community had started asking uncomfortable questions about VitaWatch's data collection practices. Without my surveillance data to support their investor presentations, and facing increased scrutiny about informed consent protocols, the company struggled to secure its next round of funding. I felt no satisfaction in that outcome, but I didn't feel guilty either. If Mike's business model depended on secretly surveilling vulnerable family members, then it deserved to fail. The seasons changed around my new home in ways I hadn't noticed in years. Without automated systems adjusting everything for optimal comfort, I became aware of weather patterns, temperature shifts, the way light moved across my rooms throughout the day. I opened windows when I wanted fresh air, closed them when it got cold, adjusted my clothing and activities to match the natural rhythms of the world outside. Winter came early that year, with a snowstorm in November that blanketed my garden and turned my oak tree into a sculpture of white branches against gray sky. I sat by my window with tea and watched the snow fall without anyone tracking my mood or suggesting seasonal affective disorder treatments based on my behavioral patterns. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door during the storm, bringing homemade soup and checking to make sure I had enough firewood. It was the kind of genuine community care that technology promised but could never actually deliver, human connection based on choice and kindness rather than monitoring and data analysis. "I hope you don't mind me saying," she said as we watched the snow together from my living room window, "but you seem so much more relaxed than when you first moved in." Happier. She was right. I'd carried tension in my shoulders for months without realizing it. The physical stress of living under constant surveillance, of never being completely alone with my thoughts and feelings. Now my body had remembered how to rest, how to exist without performing. Spring brought new possibilities. I enrolled in a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for during my years of managing everyone else's needs. Working with clay was meditative, grounding in the most literal sense. You couldn't optimize or digitize the process of centering clay on a wheel. It required patience, presence, acceptance of imperfection. My pottery was terrible at first, lopsided bowls and wobbly vases that collapsed more often than they succeeded. But that was exactly what I needed, an activity where failure was part of learning, where each piece was unique and unrepeatable, where the only data that mattered was the feel of clay between my fingers and the satisfaction of creating something with my own hands. I made friends in the class, women my age who were also rediscovering neglected interests and postponed dreams. We'd go for coffee after class, sharing stories about our adult children, our late husbands, our plans for travel and adventure. None of us were particularly interested in being tracked, monitored, or optimized. We just wanted to live our remaining years on our own terms. Eleanor became my closest friend, the kind of companion Richard and I had always hoped to have as neighbors but had never found. She was intelligent without being condescending, helpful without being intrusive, present without being demanding. We developed a routine of evening walks around the neighborhood, commenting on neighbors' gardens, discussing books we'd read, planning small adventures to farmers' markets and art fairs. "You know what I like about you, Margaret," she said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "You're present. So many people our age are either living in the past or worrying about the future, but you're actually here, paying attention to what's happening right now." I thought about that observation for days afterward. She was right. I was more present than I'd been in years. Without the constant hum of surveillance, without the feeling that my every moment was being recorded and analyzed, I'd rediscovered the simple pleasure of experiencing life as it happened. The grandchildren visited regularly, and I watched them slowly adapt to the rhythm of a non-smart home. They learned to entertain themselves without screens, to have conversations without competing with voice assistants, to appreciate the satisfying click of physical light switches and the mystery of doors that opened and closed without sensors. "I like it here, Grandma," Emma told me one afternoon as we sat in my garden, watching bees work among the tomato plants. "It's quiet, but not empty quiet. Good quiet. Out of the mouths of babes." She'd articulated something I'd struggled to explain, the difference between the sterile silence of a monitored environment and the rich quiet of genuine privacy. As my first year in the townhouse drew to a close, I realized I'd stopped thinking about Mike and Sarah's smart home as home at all. That house had been beautiful, efficient, and impressive, but it had never been mine in any meaningful sense. I'd been a temporary resident in someone else's experiment, a subject in their research study. This small townhouse, with its creaky floors and manual windows and analog thermostat, was home. It was a place where I could exist without explanation, where my habits and routines belonged to me alone, where the only data being collected was the information I chose to share with people I trusted. I learned to love the imperfections that would have driven Mike's optimization algorithms crazy. The bathroom door that stuck slightly in humid weather. The kitchen faucet that had to be turned just so to avoid dripping. The front step that was slightly uneven and required careful navigation in winter. These weren't flaws to be corrected. They were characteristics that made the house uniquely mine. I knew its moods and quirks the way you know a longtime friend's personality. It was a relationship, not a system. On the anniversary of my move, Eleanor brought over champagne, and we toasted my independence on the front porch. As the sun set behind the mountains and the smart speakers in houses throughout the neighborhood lit up with evening routines, my house remained peacefully analog. "To choosing yourself," Eleanor said, raising her glass. "To being seen as a person, not a data point," I replied. We drank to privacy, to dignity, to the radical act of living an unmonitored life in an increasingly surveilled world. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, genuinely free. The future Mike and Sarah believed in, where every heartbeat is measured, every movement tracked, every emotion cataloged, might be coming. But it won't include me. I've chosen a life that can't be quantified, in a home that knows the difference between technology and humanity. And every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own space, with no red lights blinking in the corners, I remember what it feels like to be free. Not just physically free, but emotionally and spiritually free, free to be imperfect, inefficient, unoptimized, and entirely authentically human. Some mornings I dance in my kitchen while making breakfast, terrible dancing that would probably trigger concern alerts in a smart home monitoring system. Here, it's just joy expressing itself through movement, witnessed only by the morning light streaming through windows I open myself. I talk to Richard's photograph without worrying about voice analysis software categorizing my grief patterns. I leave lights on when I feel like it, take long baths without water usage monitoring, and read whatever I want without algorithmic suggestions for my next book. I am no longer data. I am no longer a case study, or a test subject, or a prototype. I am just Margaret, and for the first time in years, that feels like everything I ever needed to be. The surveillance economy wants us to believe that being watched equals being cared for, that monitoring equals safety, that data collection equals connection. But I've learned the difference between being observed and being seen, between being tracked and being known, between being optimized and being loved. In my small townhouse, with its creaky floors and imperfect lighting, I'm finally visible to the only person who truly matters, myself. And that visibility, honest, unmediated, unmonitored, has taught me that freedom isn't just about privacy. It's about the right to be human in all our messy, inefficient, unquantifiable complexity. Every evening, as smart homes throughout the neighborhood sync their data and upload their insights about their residents' daily lives, I sit on my front porch with a book and a cup of tea, watching the mountains change color in the setting sun. My house knows nothing about my mood, my health, my social patterns, or my future plans. It only knows that I'm home.